So yeah, this will be fun. All right, I'm gonna start the stream in 3, 2, and we're live. All right, this is exciting. Here we go. Hell yeah! Hell yeah! Hey kids, so you're a little too young to understand this now, but someday you will. The biggest encroachment in my lifetime on our liberty is afoot. You only remember it today as having to put masks on when you go to the store and to school and other places of no consequence. But looking back from these things is when they really start to make sense and we see the kind of effects that they have. So this conversation is meant to benefit you and everyone who listens to it, because when a molecular biologist, a PhD statistician, and a doctor walk into a bar, they have some interesting things to say, and we should definitely listen to them. My guest today is Dr. Jay Richards. He's one of the trifecta of authors of The Price of Panic: How the Tyranny of Experts Turned a Pandemic into a Catastrophe. He's here with me now, and I'm excited to have him. Dr. Richards, how are you?
Just fine, thanks. Great to be with you.
So I want to thank you for coming on. You told me before you started that you went and got your first COVID test today, so you could be in this could be the last time anyone ever talks to you.
For all I know, I mean, it's funny, we have been mostly locked down, and of course we're under a complete lockdown during the writing of the book, but I hadn't had so much as a sniffle, and I got essentially flu symptoms, or not really even flu symptoms, cold symptoms. But I thought, I should probably go to get tested. So I went and did one of the drive-through a quick test, and in fact, I'll know in a couple of hours. So I may just have a cold, but I may have COVID, which will be an interesting experience if that's the case.
I don't want to be that guy, but if something horrible happens to you, are you going to be one of those people they say, well, he deserved it because he was writing about how COVID was a hoax, so he got what he deserved? I've seen a lot of that online lately.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, we've gotten that on social media, and I always, honestly, because there were 3 of us writing the book, and we were essentially critiquing the idea of lockdowns, we thought inevitably one of us will probably get it while we're writing it. None of us have yet, but the reality is that the arguments are the same whether I or somebody else gets it or not. You don't make public policy decisions based on private experience. You need to do it based on the best available evidence, and we've got a lot of evidence now, statistical evidence, just based on essentially the experiments that we have been running for the last 6 or 7 months of 2020. So we know a lot now that we certainly didn't know in February or March.
Well, the book's been out for a bit, and I intentionally waited till after the election, and here's a copy of it for anyone who wants to go see on my screen, The Price of Panic. Go out and pick yourself up a copy. I'm about 120 pages in, and it's excellent. I think I get so much more out of reading this than anybody who's scrolling Facebook all day long or just trying to stay in tune with the news feed. And we'll go into why that is. But what's fascinating to me is I just assumed after the election maybe the pandemic would end, and now I'm hearing 4 to 6 weeks of total lockdown. White House, Wall Street, big tech task force, and we can be done with this. So what's changed in your mind as one of the experts, quote unquote, since the election ended? Are we almost through with this now?
We're not. I mean, if you thought that it was just entirely a political ploy to get President Trump out of office, I think people will be disappointed. Now, there's absolutely no doubt that almost every news that was reported from the time we found out about COVID-19 to the present, the media took an anti-Trump angle. But notice it was mostly cynical. So in January, when President Trump, at the end of January, called for restricting travel from China, he was attacked for being, a racist and a xenophobe. But then when he started calling for lockdowns and having these White House press conferences once a day, essentially, we were then hearing that he didn't do enough. And so the reality is there was an anti-Trump animus that the media has had from the very beginning that's tainted the way in which it covers this. Nevertheless, all you have to do is look at global news to realize that this is mostly a global phenomenon. And you've got the same stuff that's happening here is happening in even more extreme in places like Australia and the UK, probably in Belgium and New Zealand. And so this isn't going away anytime soon. I do think many American politicians are somewhat cynical, and when you see them, for instance, denouncing gatherings of Orthodox Jews for worship in New York, but then embracing electoral celebrations and protests and things like that, I think certainly many politicians are cynical about the details and maybe don't necessarily believe what they're telling us. But if you look at polls, half the American public is still absolutely terrified of the coronavirus, and that's not going to just disappear overnight.
So, a personal anecdote, as part of my business, I actually go into people's homes a couple times a week. And what's interesting to me, I live in Arizona, so, it's still the Wild West, but you'll go to one house and the guy's like, put it there, man, spit on his hand. I don't care about this pandemic stuff. You go to the next house and it's full hazmat, stay outside the door, just kind of do what you need to do from the outside. And these people are essentially neighbors. And I think it is wild. And the election reinforced this. When I go to predict it and I'm, putting money on this and that, and you see people are in bubbles of two completely different news feeds in terms of what they read, what they believe, and what's reality. So this is really the reason I want to talk to you, because I think that people will be benefited from hearing your feedback on this. And also, my goal in these interviews is to pull out, I know you've done a lot of interviews, you've been successful with the book tour, but just get them 2 or 3 nuggets of things to think about that maybe they hadn't considered before. And I want to start early in your book, and that is, your chapter 1 is, where did the pandemic start? I'm sorry, maybe I'm thinking of chapter 2. It's when you start talking about the WHO and the gentleman who was in charge of the World Health Organization when this started. Yeah, it was chapter 2, who started the panic. He's an Ethiopian gentleman who has some interesting ties, some interesting background, and some very interesting, should we call them incentives? So let's start with that. Kind of enlighten us on how this all got started. Who, what, where?
Director General Tedros is the head of the World Health Organization, and WHO, that is the World Health Organization, is the public health arm of the United Nations. People probably don't know this, but you can look it up if you doubt me. Tedros is a longtime member of the Ethno-Nationalist Communist Party in his native Ethiopia. In fact, he served in several communist government administrations. He's not denounced that. That is literally his political orientation, is communism. He became the head of the World Health Organization in 2017. He actually articulated his goals. If you look at them, they're all sort of very far left-wing goals. And so the idea that this is going to be the guy essentially that manages a global health crisis like COVID-19, he's, as American foreign policy expert Gordon Chang said, that Tedros is the second to the last person you'd want to have managing a public health catastrophe. The worst one, the last person you'd want to have, would be the head of the Communist Party in China itself. But of course, it's not just that Tedros has this background. We learned in the spring that actually the World Health Organization spent 5 or 6 weeks actually carrying water for the communist regime in China. That's the Atlantic magazine, which is certainly not a right-wing publication, came out in the spring and pointed this out. He said, look, for a long time, the World Health Organization was essentially playing PR for the People's Republic of China. And as a result, there was just a bunch of unknowns. We just simply didn't know, for instance, exactly what the infection fatality rate was of the virus. We're still not 100% sure about its origin. We didn't know how infectious it was because of crucial data that we simply didn't have. And so we do think that played a part of a role. By itself, it wouldn't have made the difference, but it played part of a role in really the scariness of this thing. It came from China and the World Health Organization managed to keep the information murky. And so there's no wonder that at least at the beginning there were some blundering and then just some political actions that, in which politicians had to act without a lot of knowledge.
There's a quote, I think it's in the same chapter, you have your introduction chapter quotes, and it said, science is the belief in the ignorance of experts. And that's kind of a theme throughout the book, and it's something I want to reinforce on my kids. Science is always the mantle people wear when they're trying to push the agenda, but really what it is at heart is the cynicism of anyone who claims to know something that they may in fact not know, but they have an incentive to know. And you say later that it's always better to be wrong in the right direction than right in the wrong direction. Talk about how that evolved from there into global policy, and then we'll get into lockdowns and some notes I have on those as well.
Yeah, I mean, we mentioned the World Health Organization, but if you had read the World Health Organization's advice in 2019, in October of last year, they said that, they did major analysis of all the relevant sort of scientific literature and concluded that population-wide lockdowns would probably not make much of any difference. At least there's no evidence that they would. And they would be devastating to the economy. So WHO basically said lockdowns would be a bad idea. Well, Tedros in March heard about this predictive computer model out of the Imperial College London, which is where we got this number that 2.2 million Americans were going to die if we didn't lock everything down,
Right.
that 40 million people in the world. That's where we got those numbers. Those numbers weren't based on actual evidence. They're based on projections, based on assumptions that were plugged into this model. And it's only because Tedros and then other public health experts, such as and Dr. Anthony Fauci in the United States, glommed onto those numbers that we ended up with the response that we did. And so President Trump on April the 8th, he said, somebody in the press asked him, why he advised lockdowns. And he said, well, two very smart people came into my office and they said, Mr. President, 2.2 million people are going to die if we don't lock everything down. So he did it. Well, that number, that 2.2 million, it came from a predictive model that we almost immediately realized was completely unreliable. It was not tested against the evidence. It had an extremely unrealistic infection fatality rate of 3.4%, which is more than an order of magnitude too high. And in fact, it was written in an old computer language called Fortran and was, what one expert said, it was a buggy mess, like a bowl of angel hair pasta. It was so bad. And so the idea that a predictive model in the wrong hands, that is in the hands of a few public health officials, right, could then, because those officials had the ear of presidents and prime ministers, could lead to shutting the world down in effect. And that's what happened. So it wasn't like there was a genuine scientific debate among, where you get the 50 smartest people on the topic and have them sort of hash it out. That is not what happened. What happened is a few well-placed public health officials in governments and in organizations like the World Health Organization made this call. And media and social media essentially went along for the ride and reinforced it. And so that's how this happened. This was not the result of genuine scientific inquiry. It was the result of, that's why we call it the tyranny of experts, a few scientific officials.
You mentioned in the book, I think it's chapter 6 or 7, that what happens, this particular model had 2.2 million souls expiring and 40 million worldwide. I think 2.2 was in the US and 40 million worldwide. And you talked about the IHME and the international, there were two separate ones you mentioned, I have them written down. But as soon as the predictive models were not panning out, then they revise them immediately and give credit to their actions to support the model data. Tell us how that process, it's a little self-serving job. And you talk about how phony it is to say that the models did what they were supposed to do because of the actions we took when the actions are actually baked into the cake.
Right. I mean, models only tell you what you told them to say. That's why we talk about garbage in, garbage out. That doesn't mean a model is necessarily useless. It's just that for a model to be useful for guiding what we're going to do, it needs to be tested against the real world. So you make certain assumptions, presumably the assumptions you want them to be based on the evidence you actually have. For instance, maybe you already know independently what the infection fatality rate of this coronavirus is, then you could plug that into a model as one of your assumptions and see what the implications are. Well, we didn't know that. They were guessing based on 2 or 3 flights from China and dealing with data sets of a handful of people. They really had absolutely no idea what the infection fatality rate was. All that stuff got plugged in. Now, what we should have done is say, okay, let's test the model and see if things happen. And as they do it, it makes sense that you would adjust a model to fit the evidence. What you don't want to do is retrofit it based upon new discoveries, right? You basically adjust it to fit the predictions that you missed. That's unfortunately what was happening. And so the IHME models, which were out of the University of Washington, those were the kind of American equivalent of the Imperial College London modeling shop. They were doing this sort of the same thing. There's nothing wrong in principle with models, but if the models haven't been tested against the real world, they should not be used to guide our action. Certainly should not be used to guide global health policy, especially when the costs of the response that's being advised is so astronomical as it was in the case of the lockdowns.
I want to talk about the cost. Before I do, there's always a couple of gems that I pull out of these books and interviews that I just really want to shout from the rooftops. And one of them is under the sub-chapter called High School Science Fair. Take us through that in your best storytelling mode. It was fascinating. I feel like I should know about this already. We all should, but I didn't. So go ahead.
New York Times, did this very unassuming storytelling about the fact that this idea for population-wide lockdowns actually started with a high school science project with a high school girl whose dad works for Sandia National Laboratories in New Mexico, and she was in a high school in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and so she decided to run a simulation using the flu, this was some years ago now, to see what would happen if lockdowns occurred and how that would affect the spread of the flu through her high school. And of course, this is entirely a speculative model based on assumptions about how infectious it is and how many people interact with other people and all that sort of thing. Well, this was her high school science project. Her dad thought it was interesting, and so they actually worked together with another scientist on a paper that ended up getting published in an official CDC journal. Now, this is in the 2000s. Now, the idea of population-wide lockdowns at the time contradicted what was the received wisdom, which is that you quarantine the sick, you isolate people that are extremely high risk, and then you don't lock down populations as a whole. And there was actually a major argument between people who thought, let's try these lockdowns, and the other folks at the time who said, no, we should focus on targeted quarantines. Well, long story short, eventually the idea of lockdowns prevailed as the kind of working hypothesis for how you should respond to a pandemic. And so it was essentially waiting there in the wings of the public health bureaucracies, waiting for another pandemic in order to test. So the idea that sort of testing of population-wide lockdowns, we had not ever done this before. This was a hypothesis waiting to be tested. There was no evidence, independent evidence, apart from these speculative models, that lockdowns would actually work. And so here it just happened to be that this was the pandemic. That was sort of the tool waiting to be used. And so it got used in most countries around the world. Now, the irony is that, one, we never had any evidence to begin with that lockdowns would work. And two, we now have a lot of evidence to show that, in fact, the lockdowns don't work, that government-imposed lockdowns don't actually do what they're supposed to do. And that's honestly why we went to the trouble of writing this book on such a tight deadline, is we wanted to show that, so that we can't prevent the lockdowns in 2020, but we hope we can help prevent the lockdowns in 2021, which are almost certain to come. In fact, there are politicians already calling for them. And if we're going to do lockdowns, you want to know that they actually do some good. Otherwise, they're all pain and no gain.
My mind thinks in movies. I'm just thinking of Aliens when Bill Paxton turns to Newt and says, why don't you put her in charge? High school science fair. So in terms of that comment right there, the lockdowns, you have a whole section about comparing states and the world tour after the lockdowns work. You make a really great case that the logic around the lockdowns was flawed. The argument on the lockdowns was too short. And then you go into comparing states and world tour, which I have not read yet. So blow my mind yet again. Tell me about your data, statistical analysis comparisons. Which states did it right? Which states didn't? And talk about the world tour. I'm in uncharted territory.
Well, look at all the countries and all the individual U.S. states, and we've got data for most of them. So we have case curves and death curves and hospitalization curves. And then many of them had government-imposed lockdowns. The nice thing about the U.S. is we've got 50 different states with people trying different things. So you've got a data set to compare. Now, people will often just want to compare one country they've heard of with one other country. That's not how you do statistics. What you want to do is what you would expect. If lockdowns made a difference, what you would expect is when you look at the case curve over and over again, you'd notice that the curve bends downward after a certain amount of time after the government lockdown took place. So it's complicated. Basically, you would expect a bend in the curve about 10 or 11 days after the lockdown goes into effect. That's how long it would take. Presumably the infections would drop on day one, but you wouldn't detect them until after a sort of lag time of about 10 days. Well, and so we ran all that, and you can see it in the book. And we thought, well, let's test whether the lockdowns made any discernible difference. Unfortunately, in no case that we can tell did the lockdowns make any discernible difference in the spread of the coronavirus, which is really depressing. And if anything, I mean, correlation doesn't prove causation. But in general, the more draconian lockdowns happened in countries that also had the worst spreads, whereas you had some countries, like especially in East Asia, like Taiwan and Japan and Vietnam, which never really had lockdowns to speak of, and yet had very few deaths and very few cases. Now, we're not saying, every country is the same. They're not. There's a lot of variables that you have to take account of. Nevertheless, we think we can show fairly decisively that there's no evidence the lockdowns made any difference. And so you wonder, okay, so what was the best response in the United States? We think probably the state of Florida was the best response. We'd say South Dakota, but South Dakota had no lockdowns. It also doesn't have a lot of people, and people are spread out. And so we thought that may give them an unfair advantage. Florida's packed with people. It's got a lot of nursing homes and elderly people. But Governor DeSantis in Florida, he actually talked to scientists in Europe and found out very quickly that elderly people with health conditions were the ones most likely to be at risk of this virus, especially in nursing homes. So they focused their public health resources in Florida on nursing homes specifically, and very quickly opened up the rest of the state.
And you
And
know
of
what about
course, all the
Florida?
media
Sorry
said
for
they were.
interrupting, doctor, but the thing is of all the reasons Florida should be locked down, COVID's barely in the top 6 or 7. So I think it's a great state to go with. Sorry, go ahead.
And so we thought that's a really good representative sample. Lots of people, lots of nursing homes. And so we honestly think Florida was probably the best response. And then Sweden, if Sweden had early on focused on the problems with nursing homes, we think that they would have been fine. There's evidence that Sweden had a very light flu season the 2 years before. And so that may be part of the reason for some of their deaths. But we also think they should have paid more attention to the nursing homes early on. They corrected that in midstream. But so we would say essentially take the Swedish approach, but focus on the very high risk people, especially the elderly that are clustered together in nursing homes and retirement
When you
facilities.
say Sweden, I don't follow this as closely as I should. Did they take the Cuomo approach where they just clustered them all together in one room so they could pump up their numbers, or how did they address it?
It's just that they just really didn't initially. And Sweden is one of the few countries that chose not to lock down. They said, look, there's a public health official just basically resisted this global call for lockdowns and said, there's no, he just looked at the evidence. So there's no evidence this is going to work. We believe in freedom in this country, ironically, and we trust people to be able to use their best judgment based on the information we give them. And so they didn't lock down. They had some kind of limited social distancing, but they didn't focus enough as they should on nursing homes, because Sweden has a lot of nursing homes. And so, but what a lot of people have done is they say, well, look at the deaths per capita in Sweden compared to Norway. Norway locked down and they had a lot fewer deaths. Well, that's true, but that's, again, not how you do statistics. You can't just compare two examples. You could also compare Sweden to Belgium, which is right nearby, roughly the same population, draconian lockdowns, and a whole lot of deaths. The reality is a respiratory virus like this, you're not going to be able to literally stop it. And so what you want to do is you want to protect the people that are most at risk of dying from it. And then you let nature take its course, essentially, with the people that are at low risk. So children, for instance, are at very, very, very low risk of danger from COVID-19. They're much more likely to die of the flu than COVID-19. And so this idea that we should lock up school-age children, I mean, it just does not make any sense.
When we were talking about the logic of lockdowns, there's something I missed. There was a section where you talked about people who early on spoke against the popular narrative that was brewing. One of them's name was Aaron Jen, I think, and the other one was a German doctor whose name I did the audio recording on Audible, the audio note, and I know that it didn't write down what I think I said, so I'm not going to try to pronounce his name. But the Aaron Jen was someone who got Medium banned, and I was thinking about this because I have a video I just made. I got banned from Medium for posting a Twitter discussion I had with someone I thought was nuts. And my kids are watching Avengers Endgame, and I thought, there should be a meme where Thanos is Medium or Big Tech. He snaps, and I just go, oh, Quill, and I disappear off Medium. Talk about those two examples and how and why it happened.
Yeah. No, and I think you're talking about the German professor that was actually had all the credentials in the world, but there were a couple of examples of scientists that did a YouTube video interviews, just essentially contradicting the party line, and YouTube pulled them. I had a podcast.
And just to put some emphasis on him, he's the equivalent of like an Oxford, Cambridge, or Harvard, molecular biologist professor,
absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, he has as many or more credentials than most of the talking heads that the media actually was elevating. And then here just recently, about the same time our book came out, the Great Barrington Declaration, which is thousands of scientists from places like Stanford and Harvard and Princeton and Yale and Oxford decrying the lockdowns. I mean, this idea that these are some fringe characters is really just bizarre. But because they're contradicting what is now this kind of official party line, they're essentially alienated. Aaron Ginn is a funny example because, as you said, he had this really well-done piece analyzing the statistics on Medium. They pulled it down because he wasn't an expert. And yet then they published another piece by a guy that was no more of an expert that was riddled with errors. And I think that piece is still actually up. This is honestly what the most terrifying part of this entire controversy is, the way in which social media, incompetent social media, tried to become the referee to sort of dictate the terms of the debate rather than providing a platform where the debate could take place. I found it genuinely terrifying to watch it happen, to watch major scientific papers that would come out And if they didn't sort of fit the party line, they would, within a couple of days, they'd get buried on Google. We'd be tracking it and we'd watch them. Just Google would be actively burying this information. And so unless you're sort of actively looking for information, you have discernment. If you're just looking at your newsfeed on Twitter or watching CNN, you're just basically getting panic porn 24/7, and there's almost no chance that you're going to be able to get a balanced perspective on this.
Speaking of panic porn, good segue. Yeah, when you're talking about them being the referee, I just think of Jack Dorsey and his interviews over the years. I'm like, this is the guy. Like, this is a representative of the guy that's making decisions about who can say what. And to me, his soul is vanishing like he's Marty McFly's brother in a Back to the Future photograph. He's just kind of like, yeah, it's just, I mean, he's barely there anymore. But he gets to make those decisions and pull the strings. Panic porn. In the book, and unfortunately I'm not there yet, so I want to act like I'm really, really ahead of the game on this, but I'm not. You have a whole list of things that we're going to focus on after the wreckage is sifted through, and you call it the human cost in Chapter 10.
Mm-hmm.
Dollars, massive unemployment, deaths
Yep.
of despair, deaths from extreme poverty, deaths and illness from delays in medical care, wasted goods, crime, loss of trust, government expansion and tyranny, a grab bag of human costs. Are we already seeing excess deaths from the lockdown? Doesn't mention, did it say mental health? Deaths of despair, anxiety, depression, drug use, abuse, and really, really goofy election coverage. So,
Yeah.
or strategy, I should say. Can you kind of give the listeners just a summary of what we should expect to learn over the 1, 5, 10-year period from how this was handled? I know there are people listening to this who don't agree with anything we're saying, and their eyes are bleeding because I meet them every day. And some of them are really nice, sensible, wonderful people, but they are all in on this. So talk to us about what we're not talking about.
Absolutely. I mean, here's the key point, is that you want a response to any crisis or to any risk to be appropriate to the real risk. You don't chop off your head to get rid of a headache. That's the kind of, the bluntest way to put it. You want your response to be appropriate to the thing you're responding to, because the response itself could end up doing more damage otherwise. And that was always the problem with lockdowns. First of all, we don't think there is any evidence that lockdowns actually work. So even, we initially thought, well, the lockdowns, probably the costs were greater than the benefits. Well, turns out that there don't seem to be any real benefits. But just in terms of domestic costs, probably $1 trillion every single month to the U.S. economy from lockdowns, which is massive. Those lockdowns in 3 months cost 41 million jobs, or 41 million new jobless claims by the end of May, starting with historically low unemployment. Probably at least 75,000 excess deaths of despair in 2020. So in other words, suicide, drug, and alcohol overdoses over and above what we would expect. So entirely the result of the lockdowns. Delays in treatment and diagnosis. So one recent study estimates there will be about 80,000 missed cancer screenings. So cancers that would have been caught, right, during doctors' checkups and physicals that didn't get caught because people weren't allowed to go to the doctor and to engage in other kinds of non-COVID related medical procedures. And then very quickly you actually add up, because that was just cancer screenings. If you add things like heart disease and stroke and those sorts of things, you can very quickly, just from excess deaths from things not getting caught and excess deaths of despair, you can end up with as many deaths caused by the lockdowns themselves as are attributed to the coronavirus in the same period of time. That is the very definition of a catastrophic public health response. And that's not even getting into the fact that, of course, people lost opportunities to worship. Millions of kids lost opportunities for education, all the kind of untold anxiety and social problems that are going to attend the fact that we force children to wear masks and fear their neighbors. Those things they're going to be knock-on effects that will be hard to quantify, and we'll know more about them in the years to come. But we know right off the bat, we're talking many trillions of dollars and tens of thousands of people killed from the lockdowns themselves, just in the United States. It gets even worse if you want to talk about global poverty and starvation, because the people that are at the really bottom rungs of the economic ladder globally, they're the ones that are going to truly suffer. In fact, the UN thinks that we may be dealing with several 100,000 excess deaths from hunger just as a result of the destruction, essentially, of the global food supply chain in 2020.
It's funny, when you were describing that, I was thinking back to the high school science fair where the national epidemiologist or influenza expert that had essentially to review that submission came back and pushed back and said, no, this is a bad idea. Like, this will cause suffering on a mass scale. This will cause more pain than it solves. And as I think about what the solution really is, aside from reading your book and having normal conversations with people, as opposed to what you rightly refer to as panic porn, you have a chapter at the end of the book called Lessons Learned, and you actually quoted Chuck Palahniuk, which I thought was cool. The trick to forgetting the big picture is to look at everything close up. And so you show graphs that put this all in perspective in terms of where this ranks on global pandemics, not only in the last 3,000 years, but in the last 100 years, and what we did in response to those things versus now, and how we reacted to it, and what ended up being the case. But that was before there was a business model focused around making sure that people were essentially chipped, that you could show them anything you want to see in real time. And I look at the media and social media as all partners in this engagement business. So in terms of lessons learned, summarize for us what we do, how we move forward, and what we really take away from it, what changes we need to make to ensure that the next time, my big worry is always what happens next time they want to flip the switch. What happens if I get a sniffle and they go, lock it down. What's that? Monsters Inc. number 2319, like lock it all down. No one's going to school. No one's going to work. What do we do?
Well, no, I think that's the real danger, because I think that a public health crisis is the tool of choice for expanding the power of, I'd say expanding the power of the state, but what we're really talking about is not just the state. We're talking about this weird kind of conglomeration of big tech and government power, whatever you want to call that big glob. That's what we're dealing with. And public health crises are really powerful, because unlike, if Americans were told, okay, everybody needs to quit going to church, quit going to work, lock yourselves in your house and don't go out, it's for your own good, we would all have immediately rebelled. None of us would have actually complied with that. But instead we were told, you need to do this not for yourself, but for others, for the vulnerable. So you might want to go to church and you might be fine, but maybe you're an asymptomatic carrier. You'll spread it to the old man that's sitting in front of you and you'll kill him. And so that's a kind of moral jujitsu that was used on us, to use our own good intentions and care for other people really against us. And so I think we're going to honestly have to train ourselves to think our way through that and to say, okay, now is this really a justifiable argument, or is this just, are we being had? Is this being sort of used to force us to comply? I mean, the reality is this is not a story of big government imposing its power upon us. It's partly that story, but it's also us complying and doing it ourselves. I mean, we all saw in the spring all these stories about neighbors snitching on neighbors. I had it in my neighborhood here in suburban Washington, D.C., where people are snitching on other people for having too many people. Yeah, absolutely. A little church in, like a little charismatic Hispanic church in a neighborhood near where I live. And of course, there's some busybody that looked across the fence and saw too many people. And so they got in trouble. I mean, this kind of stuff, we internalized this, and that's the power of it. And so I honestly think if the majority of the population refuses to comply with unreasonable orders, then in most countries, it's just not going to happen. It's the fact that we so quickly complied that I think was the problem. So we got to steel ourselves against these particular kinds of arguments. But I also honestly think that we need to do something about the social media platforms. I mean, the social media platforms, I'm not one of these people that thinks the government should take over private business. That never works. And then you end up just with a private-public hybrid that's even more powerful. But the social media platforms right now are benefiting under so-called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, in which they benefit from being treated as neutral platforms, so that you can't be sued for something that somebody posts on Twitter, for instance. Twitter can't be sued for that. But they're not acting like neutral platforms. They're acting like biased publishers in which they exercise publishing and sort of editorial discretion. And so they're actually benefiting from this regulatory rule. And I think, look, if Facebook and Twitter and Instagram are not YouTube, they're not going to act like neutral platforms. They should not get that regulatory burden. And then other competitors can come up and could actually compete with them as neutral platforms. I think that's honestly part of the problem, because the social media played an outsized role in getting us to panic and then sort of sustaining the panic. And in fact, I think they're far more powerful than the normal media outlets, because, I mean, look what Twitter did, for instance, to the New York Post, the fourth largest circulation publication in the country. And they just banned their Twitter account for several weeks arbitrarily. That's something I think we're going to all have to deal with. And I think we're going to have to learn to be better consumers of media and social media, so that we're not so easily panicked, because we're now in a global world in which information can travel at the speed of light from a random street in China to somebody's phone to your retina in 25 seconds. And if we don't adapt ourselves to that, I think they're going to constantly be victims of this panic porn effectively.
Well said. I totally forgot about that whole chapter on Stasi measures. And it's funny because just the other day at work, a buddy of mine was saying, we have these friends we invite over for dinner about every month. We have a great time. Our kids enjoy each other. Politically, we're not really that aligned religiously, but we really enjoy their company. He goes, since this COVID thing started, we found out that they were just ripping us on Facebook to everyone because we're not maskers. And now we're, and I thought, it really is sad. If you looked at this from 10,000 feet and go, there's someone that's benefiting from this. There's someone that wants this divisiveness and benefits from it and doesn't really care who it hurts. So Dr. Richards, I really appreciate you coming on. I'd encourage everyone to go out and pick up The Price of Panic. I know you think you know what's going on, but this book, you're going to learn a lot from it. You're going to enjoy it, and you should share it with your friends. So thank you for joining us for the stream. Best of luck on the book tour. And what's in the works? You got anything else you're working on? Because I know you're good at tight deadlines. Are you taking a break?
Yeah, I'm never writing a book under this kind of deadline, so I think we'll probably be talking about this for the next several months. Thanks for having me.
All right, take care. Good luck.